Good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to our study of Ezekiel this morning. We're going to be in chapter 37. Last week, we were in chapter 37 as well. We studied verses 1 through 14, which was the prophecy about the valley of dry bones. Today, we're going to complete that study of chapter 37. We'll study verses 15 to 28. And I want to remind you of a couple of things. I want to talk about the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The two kingdoms came about as a result of civil war. King Solomon was king over all of Israel, and when he died, his son Rehoboam was to ascend to the throne. Now, we've been through this before, but it's important to understand this. If you can understand these things, you can understand the Old Testament, the prophets. So Rehoboam was to ascend to the throne, but the people, a lot of the people, mainly 10 tribes, did not want to follow Rehoboam, and they followed this guy named Jeroboam. And that was where the northern kingdom was formed. It was formed through civil war. Jeroboam was king. They had 10 tribes that followed him. The two remaining tribes, Judah and Benjamin, were what formed the southern kingdom. The Assyrians, the northern kingdom went immediately into apostasy and idolatry, and they got really bad, and they ended up falling to the Assyrians in 722 BC. And the southern kingdom, which was Judah and Benjamin, actually, from the standpoint of apostasy, got to be worse. According to the two sisters' prophecies that we had, they were worse than the northern kingdom. And they were conquered by Babylon and went into exile under Babylon. And they remained under somebody's thumb. The Assyrians were deported by Assyria. They were scattered among the nations. And the Babylonians sent the southern kingdom into exile, and they remained under somebody's thumb. They lost their national sovereignty when they were conquered by Babylon, and they remained under somebody's thumb, whether it be Babylon, the Medes and the Persians, the Greeks and the Romans. They remained under somebody's thumb with no national sovereignty until 1948. And the prophecy of the Valley of Dry Bones we talked about being the resurrection of Israel as a nation, that actually occurred in 1948 when the United Nations gave them some land and said you can be a country again. And that was kind of the start of the fulfillment of the Valley of Dry Bones prophecy, but it has not been fulfilled completely. And what have I told you about fulfillment of prophecy? It's not fulfilled until it's fulfilled completely in every detail, because it can look like things are headed that direction, and then something happens down the road and it just falls apart, and it turned out to be not the fulfillment at all. I'm not saying that about the 1948 deal, but that was what that prophecy was about. And what I want to say is that what I want to point out is that the two kingdoms, we have the southern kingdom before the Assyrians captured before the Assyrians captured the northern kingdom and the Babylonians captured the southern kingdom. I want you to hear these numbers. There were two nations, southern kingdom and northern kingdom, and there were two kings one for the southern kingdom, one for the northern kingdom. We had complete division on the house of Israel. So for 2,600 years, they have been without a national sovereignty until 1948 with the Valley of Dry Bones prophecy. The prophecy continually speaks. Here's the thing. The prophecies continually speak of the scattering of people and them being regathered by God and returned to the land. And that's the promised land. You know, the land was the land of Israel, the promised land. Not the Israel of today, but the promised land, which was a huge landmass, was promised to Abraham. And they've never occupied it. But the promise of them getting that land is in the Bible from beginning to end, as far as I can tell. And conditions when this occurs, when they actually get the land, when they're back in their land, we saw last week that there will be conditions, there will be Eden-like conditions of fruitfulness, and there will be prosperous times. And what is really interesting is their numbers, their population numbers will be increasing, where they're going to be as many as the sands of the seashore, as many stars as there are stars in the sky, which have been prophecies that have gone past, back even as early as Abraham. So with the gathering and resurrection of the nations, how many nations did I tell you there were? 2. Southern kingdom and northern kingdom. How many kings were there? 2. One for the southern kingdom, one for the northern kingdom. The implication of prophecy on the Valley of Dry Bones is that there will be one nation. Eventually, ultimately, there will be one nation and one king over that nation. Now we're going to see, in today's lessons, we're going to see 13 promises that are made. And I think it's just wonderful because they're promises. They're not prophecies of, you know, you're going into exile. They're not prophecies of doom and gloom. These are prophecies of hope, and promises that people that would be in captivity would be wanting to hear. And those are what God tells them, and he's going to tell them in this lesson today. All right, so let's look at verses 15 to 17 in chapter 37. Let me read this. The word of the Lord came to me. All right. Once again, it's the word of the Lord. What we're getting here is not a bunch of promises and a bunch of hope given by a man named Ezekiel. These are promises of hope given by God through Ezekiel. I've told you that probably every week for I don't know how long, but we have to remember that. This is the word of God. The word of the Lord came to me. Son of man, take a stick of wood and write on it, here's what you write on the stick, belonging to Judah and the Israelites associated with him. Then take another stick of wood and write on it, here's what you write on the other stick, belonging to Joseph, that is, to Ephraim, and all of the Israelites associated with him. In verse 17, join them together into one stick so that they will become one in your hand. All right, let me just point out, Judah is what we're calling the southern kingdom. Judah was the primary tribe that was in the south, so it just came to be called Judah. The people that were there were not all from Judah. There was a tribe of Benjamin there as well, but it was called the southern kingdom. It was called Judah. The northern kingdom was called Ephraim. Ephraim was the largest and most influential tribe of the north, and so it has come to be called southern kingdom or Israel, it was called Israel, meaning northern kingdom when it was called Israel, and or Ephraim, which was the largest and primary and most uh, influential tribe in the north. All right, so those are what you write on those tribes. You had, it's a symbolic action. We've got two sticks. One is going to represent the southern kingdom, one is going to represent the northern kingdom, and they will be joined into one stick. So he takes them and he puts them together. So you got one stick in your left hand, one in the right hand, he puts them together. So now these two sticks have become one stick. So notice each stick is referred to with the name Israel, where it's called Judah and the Israelites from Judah, and Israel meaning Ephraim, which was the son of Joseph when he was in Egypt. If you remember, he had two sons. They threw him in a well and he ended up, his coat of many colors. Remember that story? He ended up being sold and sent around and passed around. He ended up in Egypt, became the number 2 guy in Egypt. And while he was there, he had two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. And Ephraim, they ended up being adopted by Jacob. And without going through a lot of background study, that's the way Joseph got his double portion. But nevertheless, you have Judah and you have Ephraim, and they are both called Israel. Okay, so what I want to point out to you, which is very, very interesting and very, very important. I've told you that the southern kingdom was made up of 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin, and the other 10 tribes made up the northern kingdom. But when there was, Jeroboam took the northern kingdom into apostasy and idolatry almost immediately when he became king, and the Levites couldn't stand it. There was a migration. This is very important because what I have told you is that when Assyria conquered the northern kingdom, they were captive. They were sent into. They were deported and they were assimilated into the nations. So just over time, it's a natural occurrence. Their bloodline is going to be, I don't know, polluted is the word, but it's going to be changed. So they just kind of disappear. And they've been called the lost tribes. But I want to tell you, they are not the lost tribe. They are not lost. God knows exactly where they are. Now I want to show you some scripture in 2 Chronicles 11 verses 13 to 17. There was a migration. The people that loved the Lord that ended up under Jeroboam after the Civil War couldn't stand it, and they left. They just left and went down to the southern kingdom. Now listen to this as I read. 2 Chronicles 11, verses 13 to 17. The priests and Levites from all their districts throughout Israel sided with him. The Levites even abandoned we're talking about the ones in the north. The Levites even abandoned their pasture lands and property and came to Judah and Jerusalem. They left because Jeroboam and his sons had rejected them as priests of the Lord because they weren't apostate. They were still God worshipers, Yahweh worshipers. When he appointed his own priests for the high places and for the goat and the calf idols he had made, those from every tribe. Now here's what is very important. Those from every tribe of Israel who set their hearts on seeking the Lord, the God of Israel, followed the Levites to Jerusalem to offer sacrifices to the Lord. the God of their ancestors. Then verse 17 says, they strengthened the kingdom of Judah and supported Rehoboam, son of Solomon, 3 years following the ways of David and Solomon during this time. So what you end up with is it says from every tribe, those from every tribe, not the whole tribe, but those from every tribe in the northern kingdom who had set their hearts on seeking the Lord, the godly ones, left, and they went to the southern kingdom. So what you end up with in the southern kingdom is a full complement of the whole house of Israel. You got those from every tribe. Okay, so you don't have to separate those. They're already back together. All right. So notice each stick of wood is, there's something else that I found out this week, as a matter of fact, that I want to point out to you along those same lines. After what I want to point out to you is that God has never been happy with division among his people. When civil war occurred and the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom were created, that was a division of his people. He did not like that. And what I want to point out to you is that there was civil war and there was a migration we already talked about. But what you may not know is that King Hezekiah invited all of Israel to come worship Passover and celebrate Passover in Jerusalem. That's in 2 Chronicles verses 30, verses 5 through 6. So this is after the division. Hezekiah is king, and he calls on those people from Israel, from the whole part, from the division of the people, to come on down south and worship with us. He tries to call them back together. Let me read it to you. 2 Chronicles 30, verses 5 and 6. Well, he sent a proclamation in verse 5 there. It says that they decided to send a proclamation throughout Israel from Beersheba to Dan. That's Israel, the northern kingdom. It's not the whole house of Israel. It's the northern kingdom, referred to as Ephraim or Israel, or either one of those two. So he says that the plan, let's see, they decided to send a proclamation throughout Israel from Beersheba to Dan, calling the people to come to Jerusalem and celebrate the Passover to the Lord, the God of Israel. It had not been celebrated in large numbers according to what it was written. At the king's command, they sent couriers, so on and so forth, trying to get the people to come down, which they didn't do. So the division by the Civil War was brought on by the tribes that ended up in the north did not want to follow Solomon's son, Rehoboam. And we see that here Hezekiah gave them a chance to get back together with the rest, so that they would be the whole house of Israel once again. And they had I didn't show you the verse, but another interesting verse there, I didn't show it to you. I think it was verse 10 and 11. It said that those couriers were met with scorn and ridicule. They went to north to issue this to issue this invitation, and all they were met with from the tribes of the north was scorn and ridicule. So even though Hezekiah tried to get them back together, which would have made God happy if that could have been a success, he was readily shown they're not ready to get back together. Then King Josiah later on did something similar. In 2 Chronicles 34, verse 9, he issued a call for an offering to be made to repair the temple in Jerusalem so that everybody could worship together. But they remained separate. It didn't happen. They remained separate, and the northern kingdom eventually fell to Assyria. So they were still separated. They hadn't gone to war with Assyria yet, but they eventually fell in spite of the efforts of these two kings to get all the people back together again. So so God continues to issue prophecies and promises of reunification to his people. He does not like it. You know, we read this, we read through this stuff in the Old Testament talking about civil war and the separation of God's people into the northern kingdom and southern kingdom as if it's matter of fact. You know, and then we get the prophecies where God is going to call them back together and unify them. But what is important is he has never been happy with it. That's what we need to realize. Even though it happened, and we read through it like it's matter of fact, well, this is what happened. It is what happened, but God has never been happy with it. And that's why he continues to send these these prophecies where he is promising and pointing out and promising that they're going to be regathered and they're going to be a nation again. All right. So Ezekiel is told to take these two sticks and put them together. To show a symbolic reunification of the revived nation. Ephraim, the second son of Joseph, and the southern kingdom, Judah, which was the fourth son of Jacob and Leah. All right, let's look at verse 18 at chapter 37, verses 18 and 19. When your people ask you, so he is told to do this symbolic act in front of the people. When your people ask you, won't you tell us what you mean by this? So he's being told by God what to tell them when they see this, because there's going to be questions. When your people ask you, won't you tell us what you mean by this? Say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. People, this is not my words. I was told to tell you this by God himself. I'm going to take the stick of Joseph, which is in Ephraim's hand, and of the Israelite tribes associated with him, and join it to Judah's stick. I will make them into a single stick of wood, and they will become one in my hand. Okay, he does this symbolic act in public, so he gets the question, what's up? Ezekiel, what's up? He explains the two sticks, Judah and Ephraim, that become one stick in his hand. So let's look at one more prophecy that I think we'll be through jumping around, maybe. Not making any promises. I may think of something else. But Jeremiah 29:14 says this, just to let you know, it's not all in one place. These prophecies, God is serious about it, and so he does things more than once. And he usually does, when he's doing it more than once, he's doing it for what? What have I told you? When God repeats himself, he's repeating himself for emphasis. It is something that is very important. Anytime God speaks, it's important. But he's repeating it for their benefit, for emphasis. And it's in Jeremiah 29:14. It says this. It says in verse 14, I will be found. It says in verse 13, you will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. And 14, I will be found by you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back from captivity. I will gather from you from all the nations and places where I have banished you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back to the place from which I carried you into exile. Now, what is interesting here, well, first of all, that's another instance where God gives a promise. I'm going to gather you together. I'm going to get you together, and you're going to be one nation. You're going to be in the land. But what is interesting here, we talk about the northern king being assimilated into the nations and just kind of being disappeared. They've been called the lost tribes, but they're not lost. God knows where they are. But the interesting thing is, and what I've said is, I wonder how God is going to do that. How's he going to get them back together? They're dispersed. They're everywhere, and he said what he's calling back is actually their descendants. How's he going to find all them? What he has said, I want you to listen to this again. You will call on me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. He has said that at some point in the future, we know that to be at the point of the return of Messiah, the return of Jesus, that they're going to realize, we'll talk about it in Zechariah, they're going to realize that they crucified their Messiah. And they're going to turn to him. They're going to see his wounds when he comes again. They're going to realize it, and they're going to mourn for him like a father mourns for an only son. They're going to turn to the Lord. They are going to turn to God, and God will find them. Because they are looking for him, God will find them. That's what's very interesting. He's not going to have to go looking under rocks and looking in back streets and alleys and, flea bag hotels, 5-star hotels, downtown Dallas, downtown here, downtown there. They're going to be looking for God. And he says, I will find you. He said right there, you will seek me with all your heart. I will be found by you. They're going to find God. That's an important scripture to remember. They are going to find God. When they turn to him, they will find him. All right. So let me keep going here. That's just one other scripture that says he's going to gather them, but they're going to find him. They are going to find God themselves. That's from God's own lips right there. Okay, so verses 20 to 23. Let me read verses back to chapter 37, 20 to 23. Says this. Hold before their eyes the sticks you have written on, and say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I will take the Israelites out of the nations where they have gone. I will gather them from all around and bring them back into their own land. Verse 22, I will make them one nation in the land on the mountains of Israel. There will be one king over all of them, and they will never again be two nations or be divided into two kingdoms. Then verse 23, they will no longer defile themselves with their idols and vile images, or with any of their offenses, and their offenses were against God's law. For I will save them from all of their sinful backsliding, and I will cleanse them. They will be my people, and I will be their God. Very, very interesting. He refers to them as one nation, the Israelites. The northern kingdom, the southern kingdom, and all of the Israelites, regardless of where they are, what time of year it is, what time it is in the future, whenever this occurs, which will be during the millennium at the second coming of Jesus, he's going to call them Israelites. He will gather them back to their own land. The land looks like a pretty big deal. They will all get to come home again. In verse 22, he says, you'll be one nation on the mountains of Israel. In other words, you'll be in your own land. You'll have one king. We already know it's going to be King David. I think we saw that last week or week before last. The two kingdoms will never, there will be never be two kingdoms again, never be two nations. And they will, my paraphrase is, they will never worship idols again. That's one thing God was successful at all these things he's been doing. He did get rid of idolatry, traditional idolatry in Israel. God will save them from their sinful backsliding. And then verse 23, it says, I will cleanse them. We saw all that back in the Zechariah. We won't go look at it again. It seemed like we were looking at it every week for a while. Zechariah 12 and 14 talks about this very thing, about how they're going to be cleansed on that day of the return of the Messiah. I will be their God, it says. They will be my people, it says. He has said this many times, and what have I said about repetition? When God says things more than once, he says it. I'm not speaking for God, but I know in general when anybody says something more than once, he's doing it for emphasis and importance, emphasizing the importance of what he has to say. And these things he's saying more than once. God wants them to know this, and this is a promise. Furthermore, in verses 22 and 23, regarding the permanence of the new nation, we see several negative terms that say there's never going to be two nations again. There's never going to be two kings again. There's never going to be a separation again. It's sometimes you get emphasis when you say never. When you use the negative term, you're getting emphasis on what is actually being told to the people. In verse 24 to 25, let me read that. My servant David will be king. Oh, here we go. We're being told again. Thought we saw it last week too. Well, I won't go back and look for it, but we've seen it in the last couple of weeks for sure. So verse 24, 25, my servant David, listen to this, my servant David will be king. That's not a descendant of David. It's not Jesus. It says, my servant David will be king over them, over Israel, and they will all have one shepherd, and that's going to be David. He's going to be king, and he's a servant. He's going to be a king, and he's going to be a shepherd. They will follow my laws and be careful to keep my decrees. Verse 25, they will live in the land I gave to my servant Jacob, the land where your ancestors lived. They and their children and their children's children will live there forever. That's a great word, forever. And David, my servant, will be their prince forever. Okay, he's going to be a king, and there's going to be one king, one shepherd, and one prince forever. I pointed it out as we read through it. Obviously, David is dead. But we know that for him to be king, he's going to have to be resurrected. And we know that that's exactly what's going to happen. We've talked about the resurrection of the saints. It's important he will be a shepherd. This is a sweet thing to think about. Remember, we had a lesson on the bad shepherds, the shepherds that were not shepherds at all. They were leaders that did not care about their flock. They only cared about themselves. And everything we talked about was bad. But this new king will be a real good shepherd. He will be a real shepherd and a good shepherd, a real good shepherd. They will be led by God's Spirit, We saw that in verse 14. They're going to follow his laws and keep his laws. And it says in verse 24, they're going to get new hearts, hearts of flesh, rather their hearts of stone are going to be removed, and God's law is going to be written on their hearts of flesh. They're not going to need a book or a scroll to have the laws written. They're just going to know what it says. We talked about that. They have never been able to do this before. Now they will be led to follow from chapter 37, verse 14. They will live in the land promised to Jacob for how long? Forever. Forever, it says that. In verse 26 says this, I will make a covenant of peace with them. It will be an everlasting covenant. Everlasting, what a good word. I will establish them and increase their numbers, and I will put my sanctuary among them forever. There's the word forever. The sanctuary, God's sanctuary will be among them forever. We saw that in Revelation. This is not, all right. The Hebrew word olam is used 5 times in verse 25 to 28. It's a word that means forever or everlasting. I like the sound of forever, but everlasting I think is my preference. It's an everlasting covenant, it says. He will make a covenant of peace. The duration is forever, an everlasting covenant. He will increase their numbers. It's important from the standpoint of how many survivors the assault on Babylon left. There weren't that many in relative numbers. There were a lot of people, but we talked about it last week, most of the men died. You have no men, it's hard to have new babies. So their numbers dwindled. We have the promise here that their numbers are going to increase again. That's a big deal. You know, until you really consider what happened to the people, it's real easy to just read that over as a promise that's not all that important. But when you're talking about a people that have been through horrible, horrible persecution and death, it's a very uplifting and hopeful promise to receive. Their numbers will increase. But here's what I think is great. He's going to establish his sanctuary among the people forever. Remember, chapter 10 was the chapter I told you in my personal study when I studied Ezekiel on my own. Chapter 10 was a crushing time for me. It said that the glory of God, God's glory, left the temple. That was one of the things that people were counting on. One of their 4 false assumptions was that God's temple was there and he would never allow Jerusalem to be destroyed or captured. Well, because that's where he lived. He didn't live there anymore. He left. He vacated, his glory vacated the temple. The promise here is it's coming back. He hadn't come back yet. He didn't have a temple to come back to, for one thing. But he will be coming back. That's the promise. His sanctuary will be among them. It'll be among them forever. Okay, verse 27. Let's look at that. My dwelling place, there's that word again. I love dwelling place. That's better than living there. See, the place where I live is one thing, but my dwelling place, sweet. My dwelling place will be with them. I will be their God and they will be my people. That is a big deal in itself, because there was a time when God put that relationship with his people on hold back at the beginning of Hosea. He said, I'm not going to call you my people anymore. Put it on hold. Then the nations will know that I, the Lord, make Israel holy. This is no big deal either. Let me continue reading. Then the nations will know that he said, I will be their God and they will be my people. In verse 28, then the nations will know. Well, before I read that, verse 27. The sanctuary will be there and God will dwell with them. And I'm saying, how wonderful is that? When we studied Revelation and we talked about God dwelling there and dwelling with us, with his people, that is probably the best of all of it. Well, dwell is the best word, I think. It's much better than live with. He will dwell with them. He will be their God, and they will be his people. And in my notes, I wrote, finally. They will all be back together. Their relationship is going to be perfect. And verse 28 says this, then the nations will know. Ponder on this as I read it. Then the nations will know that I, the Lord, make Israel holy when my sanctuary is among them forever. You remember over the last couple of weeks, I talked about for the sake of my name, or for my sake, where God is talking, for my sake, I'm going to do these things for my sake, or for the sake of my name. The people were being harassed by their captors. Your God he's so great. He's the one that's supposed to take care of you. They were mocking God. And God couldn't let that stand. He has to act. He's making these promises. He's going to do it. And he says, when I do it, the nations will know that I, the Lord, make Israel holy when my sanctuary is among them forever. He's going to be there. His presence is going to make people holy. We can't be holy on our own. We can't just say, I'm going to live a holy life. No matter how hard you try, you can't do it. We were declared holy. When we come to God through our faith in Jesus Christ, we are declared holy. The same here is with his people. When he lives among them, his presence will make them holy. I, the Lord, make Israel holy. That's what that verse said. So the Lord makes Israel holy. God will be proved holy among the nations. All that mocking they did about God, what a wimp he is, he's going to be proven to be holy by his presence, and he will make Israel holy. When all of this happiness, when all of this happens, the nations will know that the Lord makes Israel holy. When verse 26 is fulfilled, his sanctuary will be among them forever. This stuff has not yet happened. These are some implications from Ezekiel used in prophecies which are important. Now, I want to read something to you, and then we'll be done. It kind of gets all this together. In verses 15 to 28, there are 13 promises. And I want to read to you what they are. You heard them, but you heard them as we went through the scriptures. I want to read them all, get them all together. It's on New American Commentary, verse 327. And I'll just preface these promises with the comment I make. They have the southern kingdom was taken into captivity in Babylon for 70 years, and then they were returned to Israel. That is not the fulfillment of the prophecy of being gathered and returned to Israel. It is a return to Israel, but there's a deeper and more forward-looking fulfillment of the prophecy, which we have talked about being at the second coming of Jesus Christ. So let me read, with that in mind, I want to read this to you. It's 13 promises. There were 13 promises made to Israel in verses 15 to 28 that illustrated God's determination to revive, revitalize, restore, and establish the nations of Israel, the nation of Israel. First, God will personally find Israel and gather the people from among the nations. Second, God will bring them again into the land that will be restored to them. Third, God will make one nation of two that had been in the land. So in the same land, the promised land, God's people couldn't live together. He said, you go live in that part of the house and I'll live in this part of the house. God doesn't like that. He's going to make one nation out of the two that had been living in the same house, living in the same land. Fourth, God will set one king over the nation. There's going to be one king. We won't need two. They're revived and rejuvenated. And the fifth promise is that God will ensure the unity of the restored kingdom that will never again be divided. Never again. If God says it, he means it. And he says, I will do it. All right. Sixth, God will ensure that the people will never again serve idols. I've already commented on that. He got rid of idolatry, traditional idolatry. 7, God will save them, cleanse them, and establish an intimate personal relationship with them. 8, God will enable them to walk in obedience to his law. They're going to have new hearts, if you recall. They're going to have new hearts, hearts of flesh. Their hearts of stone are going to be removed. And his law, his word is going to be written on their hearts. They're not going to have somebody teach it to them. They're just going to know what to do. 9th, God will establish them in their land forever. That's a big word, forever. 10th, God will establish the new covenant of peace with them. 11, God will multiply them in the land. So their numbers are going to increase and they're going to enjoy prosperity and peace. Prosperity with peace. 12, God will establish his sanctuary among them and personally dwell with them, dwell there forever. God, and then 13, God will make Israel a testimony to the nations of his saving grace. God won't be a laughingstock like he was when they were going into captivity all those times with Assyria and with Babylon. He's going to be made holy and they're going to understand who God is, all of the nations. Okay, that wraps up chapter 37. We'll start with 38 next week. I don't know if we'll get 38 and 39 done. It's about a big, big war. Nobody seems to know where it is or what it is. We're going to see that there's 3 or 4 different choices on the matter of what it can be. There are some interesting things in there, though. War is not just necessarily war. There's some things that we need to know about it, and I think you'll find it interesting. So until next week, thank you again for studying with me.